Some moments in baseball arrive quietly. A transaction posted on the league wire at midnight. A roster move buried in a press release between injury updates and schedule changes. A decision made in a conference room somewhere that ripples outward slowly, taking days or weeks before the full weight of it lands on the people it affects. And then there are moments like this one. The announcement came down from the league office on a Tuesday morning, and within minutes, every phone in every baseball clubhouse in America was buzzing. Not because punishments are rare in Major League Baseball, they are not. Players get fined and suspended with enough regularity that most of the time, the news comes and goes without much friction. But this was different. This was a punishment handed down for a violent play on Shohei Ohtani. And when the name Shohei Ohtani appears in a sentence alongside the words violent play and punishment, the baseball world does not move slowly. It stops. It reads every word twice. It forms opinions and arguments and takes sides before the full story has even been told. The Angels' first baseman had crossed a line. The league had said so officially, in the clearest possible language. And now, with the punishment made public, every set of eyes in the sport turn to the same place they always turn when something significant happens involving the most famous baseball player on the planet. They turn to Ohtani. And Ohtani, for perhaps the first time in his career, did not give them composure. He did not give them a measured smile or a carefully translated diplomatic response. He did not perform the gracious silence that had become, over years of public life, one of his most recognizable qualities. He gave them fury. To understand why the league acted with the speed and severity that it did, you have to understand what happened on the field, not just the mechanics of the play, but the intent behind it. Baseball has always lived with a certain amount of physical contact. It is part of the game's fabric: collisions at home plate, hard slides into second base, brushback pitches that send batters stepping off the box. There is a line between competitive aggression and something else, something that the rulebook addresses carefully and that veteran players recognize immediately when they see it. The line is not always perfectly clear. But sometimes, it is unmistakable. What the Angels' first baseman did was unmistakable. The play developed in the kind of ordinary baseball moment that happens dozens of times a game: a ground ball, a throw to first, a runner arriving at the bag. But what followed the arrival was not ordinary. What followed was deliberate. A movement that had nothing to do with reaching the base and everything to do with reaching the man standing on it. The contact was violent. That word, violent, does not appear in official league communications casually. It is chosen precisely, with full awareness of what it means and what it implies. When the league office reviewed the play, when the umpires submitted their reports, and when the disciplinary committee convened to assess what had happened, that was the word they kept returning to. Violent. Intentional. Unacceptable. Witnesses on the field described a moment where time seemed to slow, where players from both sides recognized simultaneously what had just occurred and stood for a half-second in collective disbelief before the full noise of the situation descended. Ohtani, who had been on the receiving end of the play, was on the ground. Trainers moved quickly. The crowd, which had been in full-throated game mode seconds earlier, fell into the particular silence that stadiums produce when something has shifted from sport into something more serious. In the Angels' dugout, there was no celebration. Even among players who had complicated feelings about Ohtani's departure, and as established, those feelings ran deep, there was no fist-pumping, no satisfaction. Because what they had just watched was not a hard-nosed baseball play. It was something that every honest person in that dugout recognized as having gone too far. The first baseman himself, standing near the bag as the trainers attended to Ohtani, wore the expression of someone who had made a decision and was already, in real time, beginning to reckon with its consequences. The speed of the league's response was itself a statement. Disciplinary proceedings in Major League Baseball are not known for their urgency. The process, by design, includes time for review, for appeals, for the careful weighing of evidence and testimony. Players receive notices. Unions consult. Timelines are established. The machinery moves, but it moves deliberately. Not this time. Within 24 hours of the play, the league office had completed its review. Within 36 hours, the punishment had been determined. And within 48 hours of the moment the Angels' first baseman made contact with Ohtani on that field, the announcement was public, a suspension of significant length, accompanied by a fine, and language in the official statement that left absolutely no room for ambiguity about how the league viewed what had occurred. The Players' Association, which almost reflexively contests disciplinary actions on behalf of its members, was notably measured in its initial response. Sources within the union acknowledged privately that the play was difficult to defend, that the evidence, viewed from multiple camera angles at full speed and in slow motion, told a story that was hard to argue against. The Angels organization released a statement. It was brief. It expressed that the club supported the league's authority to discipline conduct that falls outside the standards of the game. It did not defend the play. It did not use the language of teams that believe their player has been treated unfairly. It was, in the specific vocabulary of organizational crisis management, a statement of acceptance. And that acceptance, from the club, from the union's muted response, from the speed of the league's action, communicated something clearly to everyone paying attention. What happened to Ohtani was serious enough that even the people who might normally push back chose not to. The question that remained, the question that the entire baseball world was holding its breath over, was what Ohtani himself would say. He released it through his representative on a Wednesday afternoon. Not a video. Not a press conference appearance. Not the kind of carefully staged moment that public relations teams construct when they want to control every visual element of a message. Just words. Clean, direct, unambiguous words that arrived in the inboxes of every sports reporter in the country simultaneously and spread across the internet within seconds of landing. The statement began where all of Ohtani's public communications begin, with gratitude. To the fans. To the sport. To the people who had reached out with concern after the play. The opening was familiar, recognizable, the Ohtani that the public knows and has come to expect. And then it changed. The second paragraph of the statement did something that Ohtani has almost never done in his public life. It named the injury. Not vaguely, not with the cushioning language of lower body discomfort or precautionary evaluation that teams use to minimize and obscure. He named it. He described what the play had done to his body, the specific physical consequence of a moment of deliberate violence, and he did so with a directness that landed like a punch. The third paragraph was where the fury arrived. Ohtani wrote that what happened on that field was not baseball. That competitive aggression and intentional harm are not the same thing, and that anyone who has spent time in this sport understands the difference. He wrote that he had played the game at the highest level on 2 continents for his entire professional life and had never, not once, confused the two. He expected the same understanding from every player who steps onto a major league field. He wrote that the league's response was appropriate and that he supported it fully. And then, in the sentence that every reporter highlighted, that every television analyst read aloud on their broadcast, that every player in every clubhouse read in silence and then read again, he wrote that he would be back. That what had been done to him on that field had not diminished his commitment to this game by a single degree. That if the intention had been to intimidate him, to rattle him, to introduce doubt into the mind of a player who had built his entire professional identity on the elimination of doubt, it had failed. It had failed completely. The statement ended with 3 words that were so simple and so charged that they required no elaboration: I will return. By Wednesday evening, the baseball world had fully processed what it had witnessed. Players across the league, veterans, young stars, role players who rarely generate headlines, were speaking. Not all of them publicly. But in the conversations that happen between at-bats, in the texts exchanged between players who share agents and share histories, in the group chats that connect people across organizational lines, the response was nearly unanimous. What had been done to Ohtani was wrong. The punishment was justified. And the statement, the furious, uncharacteristically direct statement, was not just accepted. It was respected. There is a specific currency in a baseball clubhouse that has nothing to do with batting average or contract value. It is the currency of authenticity, of being exactly who you are when the situation is difficult, of not performing a version of yourself that is designed to manage perception. Players can detect the difference between a calculated statement and a genuine one within seconds. They have been around enough of both to know. Ohtani's statement was genuine. Every player who read it knew it immediately. And that genuineness, that willingness to step outside the careful, managed presentation that has defined his public image and speak with unfiltered honesty, elevated him in the estimation of people who already held him at the highest possible level. His own teammates, who had watched the play with the particular horror of people who care deeply about the person being harmed, responded to the statement with something that went beyond support. They responded with a kind of galvanization. The Dodger clubhouse, which had been processing the incident with the controlled professionalism of a championship-caliber organization, was transformed by those words. "I will return." In two clubhouses, those three words meant entirely different things. In Los Angeles, they meant fuel. In Anaheim, they meant something closer to a reckoning. For the Angels organization, the punishment and its aftermath represent a crisis that extends well beyond the suspension of one player. Reputations in baseball are built slowly and damaged quickly. The league's official characterization of the play, violent, intentional, unacceptable, attaches itself to an organization's identity in ways that a single statement cannot fully undo. Free agents notice. Coaches notice. The players who are currently in the Angels system and thinking about their long-term futures notice. The first baseman himself faces a suspension that removes him from the lineup during a stretch of games that the Angels cannot afford to give away. But the cost is not primarily competitive. The cost is reputational, the cost of being the player and the team associated with a deliberate act of violence against the most famous baseball player in the world. How the Angels respond in the coming weeks will define them as much as any game result. Do they allow the incident to become a symbol of organizational character? Or do they move decisively to demonstrate that what happened on that field does not reflect who they intend to be? Those decisions are being made right now, in offices and meeting rooms in Anaheim. And the entire sport is watching to see what those decisions produce. For Ohtani, the statement marks a turning point that goes beyond the incident itself. For years, since his arrival in the major leagues, through his years in Anaheim, through the global spectacle of his free agency and his arrival in Los Angeles, Ohtani has maintained a public presentation of extraordinary control. He has been, in his public life, almost perfectly composed. Almost perfectly measured. Almost perfectly impossible to provoke into revealing what burns underneath the surface. What the Angels' first baseman did on that field, violently, intentionally, unacceptably, accidentally gave the world something it had never quite seen before. It gave the world Ohtani unfiltered. Ohtani angry. Ohtani refusing to absorb and redirect and manage, and instead choosing to speak with a directness that made every carefully worded statement he has ever released feel like a prologue to this one. The baseball world is better for having seen it. Not because violence should be celebrated or because fury should be mistaken for strength. But because athletes who are willing to be fully, honestly human in their most difficult moments remind us of something important, that the pursuit of greatness does not require the erasure of genuine feeling. Ohtani told the world he would return. And everyone who read those words, teammates, opponents, fans, the first baseman who is now sitting with the weight of what he did, understood that the return would not be quiet. The suspension will be served. The games will be played. The schedule will continue its indifferent march forward, as baseball schedules always do, regardless of what has happened off the field or between the lines. But the landscape of this rivalry has shifted again. What began as a complicated departure has become something more layered, more personal, more combustible. Every future meeting between Ohtani and the Angels now carries the specific gravity of what has occurred, the confrontation, the violent play, the punishment, the statement. The Angels' first baseman will eventually return from his suspension. He will stand at first base again. And at some point, perhaps in a game that means something, perhaps in a moment that the schedule randomly produces without drama, Ohtani will arrive at that base. What happens in that moment will say more about both of them than any statement ever could.